Margaret Collins glanced at the dashboard clock for what felt like the 100th time. She was exactly 45 minutes late for Thanksgiving dinner, stranded earlier that evening beside a rain-soaked highway after her aging sedan refused to start. A helpful stranger had eventually given her a jump, but by then the freezing November drizzle had soaked through her coat and stolen any excitement she had felt about seeing her family. At 68 years old, Margaret still believed holidays were sacred. Ever since her husband, George, had passed away 7 years earlier, she treasured every chance to gather around a table with her son, grandchildren, and whatever relatives happened to visit. Family, she often reminded herself, wasn't measured by perfection but by showing up for one another. Balancing a freshly baked apple pie in a glass dish, she climbed the stone walkway leading to her son's house. Warm golden light spilled from the windows, and cheerful laughter drifted into the chilly evening air. A small smile crossed her face. At least they're having a good time. She stepped onto the porch and reached for the doorbell. Before she could press it, another burst of laughter floated through a slightly open dining room window. The old weather stripping had never sealed properly. She had reminded Ryan several times to replace it, but he always said he'd get around to it someday. Margaret paused only to catch her breath. Then she heard Melissa's voice. "Since she's almost an hour late, let's just eat without her." A few people chuckled. Melissa continued, her tone casual enough that it almost sounded harmless. "Honestly, these dinners are easier when she isn't here. She follows everyone into the kitchen, asking questions, telling old stories. It's exhausting." More laughter. Margaret stood perfectly still. The warm pie suddenly felt heavier in her hands. She waited. Surely Ryan would say something. Surely her own son would defend her. Instead, she heard him sigh. "Yeah, it is a little quieter." Those 6 words cut deeper than anyone inside could possibly imagine. Margaret closed her eyes. 34 years of marriage had taught her patience. 7 years of widowhood had taught her dignity. She had learned that heartbreak didn't always arrive with tears. Sometimes it settled quietly in your chest until you couldn't tell whether you were breathing or simply surviving. She took one slow breath, then another. Without making a sound, she reached into her purse and removed the spare house key. Very few people knew she still carried it. After all, she had bought the house herself 6 years earlier. When Ryan and Melissa were expecting their second child, they had been drowning in rent payments. Margaret had sold the large family home she once shared with George and purchased this beautiful 4-bedroom property outright. The deed remained entirely in her name. She never charged them rent. She only asked that they cover utilities and keep the home in good condition. At the time, it had seemed like the perfect arrangement. She had wanted her grandchildren to grow up somewhere safe. She had wanted Ryan to have opportunities she and George never had. Instead, somewhere along the way, generosity had quietly transformed into expectation. Margaret unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Conversation stopped instantly. 8 faces turned toward her. Ryan looked surprised. Melissa's smile disappeared. Margaret calmly placed the pie on the dining room sideboard before looking around the table. "I'm glad everyone started without me," she said gently. Nobody answered. Her voice remained calm. "I only came to let everyone know something important." Ryan slowly stood. "Mom?" Margaret looked directly at him. "I've decided to put this house up for sale on Monday." The room fell completely silent. Melissa blinked several times. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You heard me." Ryan laughed nervously. "Mom, that's not funny. I'm not joking." Melissa forced a smile toward her parents, hoping someone would rescue the conversation. "Margaret, Thanksgiving isn't the time for jokes like this." Margaret folded her gloves carefully and placed them beside the pie. "This isn't a joke." She looked around the room before continuing. "Linda Brooks, my real estate agent, will arrive Monday morning at 10 o'clock to photograph the property. I'd appreciate it if the kitchen counters were cleared before she gets here." The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly. Ryan stared at her. You can't be serious." Margaret met his eyes. "I've never been more serious." She pulled out an empty chair and sat down as though nothing unusual had happened. Only then did she quietly add the words that changed everything. I realize tonight that I've spent years providing a home for people who no longer want me in it. Nobody spoke. Nobody even reached for their dinner. For the first time in many years, Margaret wasn't asking anyone for understanding. She was simply informing them that her kindness had reached its limit. Ryan remained standing, gripping the back of his chair, as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. "Mom," he said carefully, "this house is our home." Margaret folded her napkin across her lap with steady hands. "You live here," she replied, "but I've always owned it." Melissa's father, Thomas Carter, exchanged an uneasy glance with his wife. Neither of them had known the arrangement. They had assumed Ryan and Melissa had purchased the beautiful colonial home years ago. Melissa forced another laugh, though this one sounded brittle. "Margaret, let's not ruin Thanksgiving over a misunderstanding." "There isn't a misunderstanding," Margaret answered. "Only a realization." Ryan rubbed the back of his neck. "If this is because of what you heard, it is." Silence returned. Margaret wasn't angry anymore. She was disappointed. There was a difference. "I've spent years convincing myself that your disrespect was unintentional," she continued. "Tonight, I finally understood it wasn't." Melissa crossed her arms. "You overheard one conversation. I overheard enough." Ryan stepped closer. "We were frustrated. People vent sometimes." Margaret looked at him with gentle sadness. "Complaining that I ask about my grandchildren isn't venting. Saying family gatherings are better without me isn't frustration. It's honesty." Nobody argued, because nobody could. Melissa's mother quietly lowered her eyes to her plate. Thomas cleared his throat. "Perhaps everyone should calm down." Margaret smiled politely. "I am calm." She reached for a glass of water and took a slow sip. "I simply refuse to continue pretending everything is fine." Ryan looked increasingly desperate. "Mom, please don't sell the house." "Why not?" "Because the children grew up here. So did my sacrifices." That sentence landed like a stone. Ryan opened his mouth but found nothing to say. Margaret continued quietly. "When your father died, I received enough money to live comfortably." She looked around the dining room. "I could have traveled. I could have bought a waterfront condo. I could have spoiled myself." Instead, she glanced toward the hallway where family photographs decorated the walls. "I bought this house because I wanted my grandchildren to have stability." Ryan lowered his head. "I know. I paid for the roof after the hailstorm." No one spoke. "I replaced the heating system when it failed." Melissa shifted uncomfortably. "I purchased the SUV parked outside because I wanted my grandchildren riding in a safe vehicle." Thomas slowly looked toward his daughter. His expression had begun to change. Margaret wasn't exaggerating. She was simply listing facts. "And every time there was an emergency," she continued, "I wrote another check." Ryan whispered, "Mom," she raised one hand. "I'm not saying these things because I want gratitude." "Then why?" "Because somewhere along the way, kindness became entitlement." Melissa's face hardened. "You offered to help. I did. So you can't throw it back in our faces now." Margaret met her eyes. "I'm not throwing generosity back at you." She paused. "I'm withdrawing it." Melissa's jaw tightened. "That's unfair." "No." Margaret stood slowly. "Unfair is opening your heart to people who secretly hope you stop showing up." The dining room became painfully quiet. Ryan reached for her arm. "Please don't do this." Margaret gently stepped away. "I've spent 6 years trying to earn a place in a house that legally belongs to me." She picked up her purse. "I'm done asking permission to exist." Melissa suddenly spoke, her voice sharper than before. "So what happens now?" Margaret answered without hesitation. "Linda Brooks will list the property Monday morning. And us? You have 30 days to make other arrangements." Melissa stared at her in disbelief. "You'd really throw your own family out?" Margaret looked directly at her. "I'm not throwing anyone out." She glanced around the elegant dining room. "I'm simply taking my life back." Ryan's shoulders slumped. For the first time, he realized this wasn't another argument that would disappear after an apology. Something fundamental had changed. Margaret had crossed a line she would never uncross. She walked toward the front hallway. Just before reaching the door, she stopped. "Oh, Ryan." He looked up hopefully. "Yes? I'll also need the keys to the SUV before I leave." Ryan's face lost what little color remained. Melissa turned sharply toward him. Neither of them spoke, because they both understood exactly what those words meant. Margaret wasn't making empty threats. She was reclaiming everything that had always belonged to her. Ryan swallowed hard and slowly reached into his pocket. His fingers closed around the SUV's key fob, but he hesitated before pulling it out. "Mom," he said quietly, "please, don't do this." Margaret remained calm. "I paid for that vehicle, Ryan. It's registered in my name and insured under my policy. I'd like the keys." Melissa stood so abruptly that her chair scraped loudly across the hardwood floor. "Absolutely not." Every eye in the room turned toward her. "You can't just walk in here on Thanksgiving and start taking everything away." Margaret's expression never changed. "I'm not taking anything away that belongs to you. It is our car," Melissa snapped. "No," Margaret replied evenly. "You've been allowed to use my car." Ryan rubbed his forehead. "Melissa," she ignored him. "This is unbelievable." Margaret opened her purse and removed her phone. "I'd rather not argue." She unlocked the screen. "I still have access to the manufacturer's owner account. If necessary, I can disable your digital key and arrange for the vehicle to be collected tomorrow morning." Melissa stared at her. "You wouldn't." "I would." The certainty in Margaret's voice erased every doubt. Ryan looked at his wife. "Just give her the keys." Melissa turned toward him in disbelief. "You're taking her side?" "I'm accepting reality." His voice sounded exhausted. "The SUV belongs to Mom." Melissa's breathing grew heavier. For years, she had controlled nearly every difficult conversation by refusing to compromise until people gave in. Tonight, no one was surrendering. With obvious reluctance, she dug through her handbag and tossed the key fob onto the dining table. It slid across the polished wood before stopping near Margaret's folded napkin. Margaret picked it up without triumph. "Thank you." She slipped it into her purse. No one reached for another bite of food. The turkey grew cold. The candles continued burning, unnoticed. Margaret looked around the table one last time. "I truly hope all of you enjoy the rest of your evening." Ryan stepped toward her. "Mom, please stay," she smiled sadly. "I don't think anyone here actually wants that." His shoulders dropped. "I'm sorry. I know you are." She paused. "But apologies matter most before trust is broken, not afterward." Those words struck Ryan harder than any raised voice ever could. Margaret walked toward the front door. Behind her, no one moved. She opened the door and stepped into the cold evening air. The rain had stopped. Fresh, crisp air filled her lungs as she walked down the driveway, carrying nothing except her purse and the pie she had baked with such care. She decided the pie would taste much better at home. The next morning, Margaret woke in the peaceful silence of her townhouse. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, while a kettle whistled softly on the stove. She prepared her favorite cup of Earl Grey tea and finally picked up her phone. 48 missed calls, 36 text messages. Nearly all of them came from Ryan. "Mom, please answer. We need to talk. Please don't sell the house. Melissa didn't mean it. The kids keep asking where you are." Margaret read every message. Then she quietly placed the phone face down. She wasn't ignoring her son out of revenge. She simply knew that emotions were still too raw for a meaningful conversation. Instead, she opened her laptop. Over the years, she had created a joint emergency account to help Ryan whenever unexpected expenses appeared. She had deposited thousands of dollars into it: medical bills, home repairs, school expenses, unexpected emergencies. She logged into the account. The recent transactions immediately caught her attention: a luxury salon, an expensive clothing boutique, a gourmet restaurant. None of them looked like emergencies. Margaret closed her eyes for a brief moment. She remembered every time Melissa had insisted they were just getting through a difficult month. Every transfer had been made without hesitation. Every promise had been accepted without question. Now she understood something she should have recognized years earlier. People rarely stop demanding help that comes without limits. She transferred every remaining dollar back into her personal savings account. Then she removed Ryan and Melissa as authorized users. Finally, she closed the account completely. The process took less than 5 minutes. It wasn't done out of anger. It was done because boundaries should have existed from the beginning. As she closed her laptop, a loud knock echoed through the quiet townhouse. Another followed, then another. Margaret looked toward the front door. She already knew exactly who had arrived. Margaret walked to the front door without rushing. The pounding continued. She looked through the peephole and saw Ryan and Melissa standing on the porch. Ryan looked exhausted, his hair uncombed and dark circles beneath his eyes. Melissa's expression was far different. Her eyes were swollen from crying, but frustration still burned behind them. Margaret unlocked the deadbolt, but left the security chain in place before opening the door a few inches. "Good morning," she said calmly. Ryan managed a weak smile. "Mom, can we please come in?" "I don't think that's necessary." Melissa stepped closer. "You closed the emergency account." "Yes." "Our debit cards were declined this morning." Margaret nodded. "They would be." Melissa stared at her in disbelief. "You emptied the account," Margaret corrected her gently. "I transferred my money out of an account that belonged to me," Ryan sighed. "Mom, we depended on that money." Margaret looked directly at him. That was the problem. Silence settled between them. Ryan lowered his eyes. "I never realized how much you were doing for us." "I know." Melissa folded her arms. "So you're punishing us?" "No." Margaret's voice remained soft. "I'm allowing you to become financially independent." Melissa laughed bitterly. "That's a nice way of saying you're abandoning your family." Margaret didn't react. "For years, I believed supporting you was helping you build a future." She paused. "Instead, I built a future where you expected me to solve every problem." Ryan rubbed his temples. "We made mistakes. You did, but we're apologizing." Margaret smiled sadly. "Apologies don't erase patterns." Melissa's patience disappeared. "You're destroying your grandchildren's lives over one conversation." Margaret met her eyes without anger. "No, I'm responding to years of disrespect that finally became impossible to ignore." Ryan took a slow breath. "What do you want us to do?" "I want you to stand on your own," Melissa scoffed. "With housing costs the way they are? You both have stable careers." Ryan nodded reluctantly. They did, between them. They earned a comfortable income. The problem wasn't income. It was lifestyle. Margaret had quietly financed so many expenses that they had never learned to live within their own means. Melissa suddenly spoke again. "If you sell the house," she hesitated before delivering the sentence she knew would hurt the most. "You'll never see the children again." Ryan turned sharply toward her. "Melissa." But the words had already been spoken. Margaret remained perfectly still. Years earlier, that threat would have broken her heart. Today, it only confirmed everything she had finally accepted. She looked at Melissa with quiet disappointment. Children should never be used as bargaining chips. Melissa said nothing. "I love my grandchildren more than you'll ever understand." Margaret's voice softened. "But I won't purchase a relationship with them by sacrificing my self-respect." Ryan closed his eyes. "I'm so sorry." Margaret believed he meant it. She also understood that sincerity and accountability were not always the same thing. "I hope one day," she said gently, "your children learn that love and generosity are gifts, not obligations." Melissa shook her head. "You've changed." Margaret smiled. "You're right. For the first time," she admitted it aloud, "I finally have." She glanced at her watch. "My real estate agent will arrive Monday morning at 10. Ryan nodded slowly. "We'll start packing." Margaret appreciated that answer. It was the first practical decision he had made since arriving. She gently closed the front door. Monday morning arrived bright and cold. Margaret drove to the property a few minutes before 10 o'clock. Linda Brooks, her real estate agent, was already waiting with a camera hanging over her shoulder. "Morning, Margaret," Linda said warmly. "Ready?" "I am." They walked toward the front entrance together. Margaret rang the bell. No answer. She waited another minute before using her master key. The front door opened. Linda stopped in the foyer. "Oh." The beautiful home had been transformed into chaos. Dirty dishes overflowed from the sink. Laundry covered the staircase. Children's toys filled nearly every room. Embry soda cans sat on expensive furniture. The mess wasn't accidental. It had been carefully created. Margaret recognized it immediately for what it was. One final attempt to sabotage the sale. Linda looked uncertain. "Should we reschedule?" Margaret smiled. "Not at all." She pulled out her phone. Within minutes, she hired an emergency professional cleaning company. Less than half an hour later, 4 cleaners arrived carrying supplies and equipment. As they began restoring the house, Ryan quietly emerged from the hallway. He looked around at the cleaners, then at his mother. Neither of them spoke. For the first time in his life, Ryan realized something painful. His mother wasn't asking permission anymore. She was acting like exactly what she had always been, the rightful owner of the home. Ryan stood silently in the foyer while the cleaning crew worked around him with practiced efficiency. Vacuum cleaners hummed through the hallways. Countertops were wiped clean, and scattered toys disappeared into neatly labeled storage bins. He watched his mother directing the preparations with quiet confidence. There was no anger in her voice, no bitterness, only calm determination. Linda Brooks walked from room to room, making notes for the listing before smiling at Margaret. "This house will photograph beautifully." Margaret nodded. "It always has." Ryan looked around the living room. For years, he had thought of it as his family's home. Now he realized it had always been his mother's generosity that allowed them to live there. He approached her quietly. "Mom," Margaret turned. "I should have defended you that night." She looked into his eyes. "Yes, I kept choosing the easier path. You did." Ryan lowered his head. "I thought keeping the peace meant staying silent." Margaret placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Silence doesn't create peace, Ryan." She paused. "It protects disrespect." Those words stayed with him long after she walked away. The house went on the market that afternoon. Because it had been carefully maintained for years and was located in one of the city's most desirable neighborhoods, interest came immediately. Within 2 weeks, several strong offers had arrived. The winning buyer offered above the asking price and requested a quick closing. Ryan and Melissa had no choice but to move. After searching for nearly 2 weeks, they signed a lease for a modest 3-bedroom apartment across town. It wasn't luxurious. There was no large backyard, no oversized kitchen, no elegant dining room for holiday gatherings. For the first time since their marriage, every monthly bill came from their own earnings. The adjustment was difficult. They canceled expensive subscriptions. They sold unnecessary furniture. Weekend shopping trips became grocery budgets. Slowly, reality replaced comfort. Melissa struggled the most. She had never imagined how much Margaret's quiet generosity had shielded them from financial responsibility. Only after losing it did she understand its value. Margaret deposited the proceeds from the sale into a retirement investment account, ensuring she would remain financially secure for years to come. Then she did something she and George had dreamed about throughout their marriage. She booked a 3-week river cruise across Europe. As she packed her suitcase, she found an old photograph tucked inside one of George's travel books. They were standing together beside a lake many years earlier, smiling as though the future held endless possibilities. Margaret smiled back at the photograph. "It's finally our turn," she whispered. A few days before Christmas, her phone rang. The screen displayed Ryan's name. "This time," she answered. "Hi, Mom." "Hello, Ryan." His voice sounded different, Keter. More thoughtful. "The kids miss you." "I miss them too." There was a brief silence. "I wanted to apologize again," he said. "Not because we need help." Another pause. "But because I finally understand how much you sacrificed for us." Margaret closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she believed every word. "Thank you," she replied softly. "I don't expect everything to go back to the way it was." "It can't," Margaret answered honestly. "I know." He took a slow breath. "Would you come by on Christmas Eve?" Margaret looked at the snow falling gently outside her townhouse window. "I'd love to see the children." Ryan smiled through the phone. "They'll be excited. "I'll stay for 1 hour. Only one? Only one." She wasn't trying to punish anyone. She was protecting the boundaries she had fought so hard to build. Healthy relationships required respect, not obligation. Ryan understood. "We'll be ready." Christmas Eve arrived with fresh snow covering the streets. Margaret carried carefully wrapped presents to the apartment building where Ryan and his family now lived. The grandchildren raced into her arms the moment she walked through the door. Their laughter filled the small apartment. For one precious hour, Margaret read stories, opened gifts with the children, and listened to their excited plans for the coming year. Ryan thanked her again before she left. Melissa approached quietly. She hesitated for several seconds. Then she spoke. "I'm sorry, Margaret." The apology was simple. There were no excuses, no blame, just regret. Margaret smiled kindly. "I hope we both learned something." Melissa nodded. "I think we did." Margaret stepped outside into the crisp winter evening. As she walked toward her car, she realized something remarkable. Selling the house hadn't cost her a family. It had helped her rebuild one on healthier foundations. She finally understood that love should never require humiliation. Generosity should never become expectation, and kindness should never come at the expense of self-respect. She drove home with peace in her heart, knowing the next chapter of her life would be written on her own terms. For the first time in many years, Margaret Collins wasn't living for everyone else. She was finally living for herself.